Now, this presentation on behalf of my colleagues here, Brad Hawks, fire specialist, Lara Van Acker, she's a forestry officer, Bill Real, another forestry officer, all of us at the Pacific Forestry Center, and Jody Axelson, she's a PhD student at the Department of Geography. Ian Cameron from Azura Infometrics has done some of the modeling that you will see here. So the title of the presentation, Ecological Impacts, is a bit of a big challenge, and I will refer only to the impacts of beetle on the ecology of pine, because if we were to talk about all the aspects of ecosystem, we'll be talking forever, and I don't have the knowledge. So, but talking about mountain pine beetle, we have to talk about disturbance, ecological disturbances. These are events that create mortality and reset ecosystems back to zero. That's what a disturbance is. So the pine beetle is an ecological disturbance, natural ecological disturbance that drives ecosystem change. And studying disturbances provide important information needed for forecasting growth and yield, and the flow of ecosystem services, such as carbon sequestration, for example. So in this work that we've been doing for the last few years, we described the pine beetle disturbance mostly in British Columbia, but we have ventured into Alberta as well. And then we basically, the goal of this presentation is to describe the transformations of the forest that are caused by the pine beetle. So talking about the ecology of Lodgepole pine is, just very briefly, it's a fire-regenerated species that following fire, it forms masses of pure pine, and that's very important for the ecology of pine beetle. So regeneration after fire is massive. Usually stands after fire really overstocked. 5,000 trees per hectare is very common. Then comes the pine beetle and kills the trees, and without going into the details, we know climate change, preference for non-host species, and created the perfect storm for beetle. Now the beetle has a huge range in North America. This is this map of the distribution of the mountain pine beetle in North America. The Alberta and BC map, part of the map is 2011. The United States part is 1970. I couldn't find any other more recent maps of the distribution of the pine beetle. Now it says probable range of the pine beetle, because it's very hard to establish the range of a species. This is probably where trees have been killed, but insects can be collected outside that range. So it shows an insect that has a tremendous potential for invasion because it's very plastic, from the deserts of northern Mexico to the boreal forest of BC and Alberta. It's extraordinary. So we talk about this last infestation in BC in the year 2000 as the most largest unprecedented outbreak in recent history. And it's true, in recent history it's the largest infestation. As you can see from the graph there, the 2000s outbreak is way out of proportion with respect to the previous outbreaks. However, history is very short. This is where aerial surveys begin. So this is when we began to actually make maps and quantify. The infestation, the previous infestation in the 1930s is not quantified in terms of hectares, but it was huge as well. It was described by a fellow called Hector Richmond, a great Canadian entomologist who wrote his memoirs in the 1980s, or he passed away in the 1980s, and his book Forever Green, meaning that this infestation in the 1930s killed millions of trees, but the forest remained green. That was his message. Okay, and as we can see here in these pictures of BC and Montana in the 1980s, BC and Montana equal, more or less similar amounts of red. But in 1985, 5 years later, the Montana side, which is Glacier National Park, is green, and the BC side is being salvaged. Then the picture on 2011, we took it from Google Earth, so it's not very good resolution. You see some greening up as the BC side was planted. So when you see these type of situations, now the forest rangers landed, when they took these pictures in the US border there, they landed on the ground and they took these pictures. This is looking at the US border before and after. And you see the forest green, forever green. Now, they've been, no, it's not what I want to say. The beetle has created enormous economic loss in BC as it removes the upper layer of the forest, which is the merchantable layer. But there are other layers and regeneration, and that's the message from this presentation. Now, the data come from central British Columbia, the Chilcotin, where that was the epicenter of the beetle outbreak in the 1980s and in the year 2000. A forest that was mostly pine. And then I ventured into Alberta, and we did some sampling in the southern part of the eastern slopes in the Waterton National Parks area, and in the northern part in the Grand Prairie area. The southern part of Alberta is historical range. There have been outbreaks before. And the northern part, we don't have records or historic records of infestations there. So this is Waterton National Park, 29 years after mountain pine beetle. You can see these are maps of the 1980s. Here, the beetle in the east of the slopes here, and Waterton National Park there. So a scientist that predecessor of me set up a whole bunch of plots here, and with Brad Hawks and Jody Axel, we went to visit them 29 years later. And this is what we see there in Waterton National Park. This is the original mortality, and now that's what remains. Here, this is deceiving because it's the deciduous component. So what happened there? So the study has used the same methodology in both areas. Basically, we date all the layers of the forest. We do sort of like a forensic study of forestry, if you want. We want to know why trees die, when did they die. We want to know the regeneration, when did it appear, dating the regeneration, and then dating all the layers that are found in the forest. Also dating all the scars and fire scars, beetle scars, and also the course with the debris to find out the various disturbances that have occurred in the forest. So the results show that pine beetle is a natural thinning agent. It promotes increased growth among the surviving trees, allowing the establishment of seedlings in the understory, and create lots, of course, with the debris. Okay, now the regeneration occurs with a variable regeneration delay, at least 6 years. We have measured. Depending on the ecosystem, regeneration delay can be a decade. Okay? So if we don't intervene, those will remain, but eventually new layers will appear. This is a typical comparative study that we do, dating the various disturbances. Here is the fire history, like this is fire scars. A very prevalent fire year was 1869, which gave rise to this is the overstory layer here, dated to that fire. This fire gave rise to the overstory, and then there's a secondary canopy that dates to the 1930s outbreak. Here you see, in the tree rings, you see release periods. As the canopy is removed, the secondary layers accelerate growth. So tree rings are much wider following outbreaks in the surviving trees. So we use that characteristic to date previous outbreaks. So here you see an event of release in the 1930s, in the 1960s, and a major release due to the 1980s outbreak in this locality, which is the Chilcotin. The first time we began to work on these releases was in the Bull Mountain area near Williams Lake. We had a 2 canopies stand, Lodgepole pine, and an understory of Douglas fir. We could see a release in the 1980s due to the outbreak there. Was fully documented, that outbreak. And then the earlier release dating to the 1930s. And interestingly, the Douglas fir originates in the 1930s, so was seeded in during this release period. And the regeneration, the Douglas fir regeneration also shows a release, so after the 1980s outbreak. Releases are not instantaneous. This is, in this case, the Chilcotin, when the outbreak occurred, and then the ecosystem starts an accelerated phase of growth with a little delay of several years, as the trees need to grow the crowns and extend the roots to occupy the space left by the killed tree. In this case, this is an average of an entire stand. In the end, the surviving trees were growing 18% faster, we estimate, that had there not been an outbreak. Now, dating these releases all over British Columbia, here south of Prince George, we notice that they are very simultaneous. In the 1970s, very prevalent periods of release. Also in the 1930s, very widespread outbreak, not documented. Now, these periods of release allow us to reconstruct the history of beetle. Is this thing working? Hello?
Yeah.
That's all. So, by dating the releases on tree rings, in this case, non-host tree, Douglas fir mixed in with, we can date the recurrency of beetle in central BC. Bam, bam, bam. And a return rate of, on average, at this location, every 52 years. For the entire province of BC, south of Prince George, we figure an average of every 40 years. And when the last 2 outbreaks, which I am old enough to have seen both of them, in the 1980s when I was a graduate student and just beginning my career, to the year 2000 is 30-something years. So beetle, as I said, initiate regeneration episodes by creating space and openings. There's episodes of regeneration. There's regeneration delays that need to be measured. But the regeneration composition depends on the initial conditions of the stand. If there's lots of pine, and also the intensity of the outbreak. If the outbreak is very intense and removes the entire canopy, the regeneration will be a light intolerant species, a shade intolerant species, sorry, like more pine. If it is a very light outbreak, shade tolerant species will prevail. So, to summarize this aspect of the work, we see that the beetle can transform stands from simple post-fire structure, one layer, to multiple layer stands, removing the canopy and providing opportunities for regeneration. This is an actual representation of one of our studies. Now, I mentioned beetle create coarse wood debris, lots of it. This is 30 years after an outbreak. Look at those trunks. And then I was asking Kathy, can industry use that wood? All those trees on the ground are from the 1980s outbreak. They've been on the ground for a long time. And we took cookies from them, and they were burnable. They're not. Now, fire interactions. Brad has been studying the relationship with fire, and we agree with the fact that the fire cycle has been interrupted by fire management. And you see fire scars here. Frequency of fire scar, and there's suddenly, starting in the 1930s, no more fire scars at this location. And that allows the forest to become older and more prone to outbreaks. This is Brad. So the Chilcotin forest has sustained 3 outbreaks, at least, okay? Now, the overstory has been, these are before the 1980s, and then these are remeasurements of this. So the overstory is going down, but the understory and the regeneration they are basically unchanged. So the result, and I say resiliency, is because this forest has 6,157 trees per hectare, waiting to grow and waiting to be food for another outbreak, okay, in a few years down the road. So that's resiliency. And we did model this. We put it in the task model. You see here, this is the volume per hectare. Before the 1980s outbreak, about 50% or maybe 40% drop. Then it grew back, but it was hit by the 2000s outbreak. And then from here is modeling, assuming different outbreaks and layers of forest being born after each outbreak with a regeneration delay. So we can, the picture shows the conditions in 2008 when we finished this study with 3 layers stand, and then as we move in time, we'll see additional layers being born and then being killed by the beetle. Okay? So the last simulation is to the year 2108. Now, moving to the eastern slopes of the Rockies now, in southern part, now the Waterton National Park, 29 years after an infestation. It was very hard work with all this course with debris on the ground, jumping through logs, stuff like that. And seedling regeneration is still not very common in some areas. Depends, there's lots of variability. But what creates a regeneration delay is all this brush but the pine is mostly down and dominated by shade-tolerant species. We did reconstruct the history of beetle in Waterton, and it was prevalent throughout the 1930s and the 1980s. This is, looks overwhelming, but it's simple to interpret. This is the overstory in 5 stands. Stand 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Red is pine, and the message here is pine is going down. It is a pre-outbreak, 1981, 2002, 2010. So the last point is 29 years after. This is pre-outbreak. So pine declining in the Waterton area. Whereas the saplings, there's no red, there's no pine. It's all the other species are coming. So forest transformation. The beetle is removing the overstory, and then new species are coming. Saplings of the various species, balsam, Douglas fir, white spruce, etc. And regeneration as well. These saplings are about 7.5 centimeters. Regeneration is below breast height. Again, there's no red. The forest is being transformed totally to non-pine forest. So that forest is resilient now. It won't be attacked by pine until another fire resets the forest. Okay. So, in conclusion, the normal cycle of this fire regenerated species is fire developing a an open canopy and then closed canopy, single species stand often. Then beetle outbreak creates tree mortality, course with debris. Then residual overstory, thinning, creating a multi-story stand. If we don't burn it, or if it doesn't burn, more beetle outbreaks will come as long as there is host. How are we doing with time? So it's still okay?
Oh, sure.
So where are we here in Alberta in this cycle? In the new habitat, we are here. We are just beginning with the first beetle outbreak. In Waterton, southern Alberta, we are in the historic habitat, already into this multi-story mixed stands. So the new habitat, now the future forest habitat, the future forest composition, now again will depend on the intensity of the outbreaks in Alberta. If the outbreaks are very intense, that means the canopies are removed. Shade intolerant species again, like pine, will regenerate. And the outbreaks might become recurrent. Now, if the outbreaks are less intense, and again, depending on the initial conditions, more shade tolerant species will prevail, and recurrency will depend on the amount of pine residual. In the historic habitat, like I said, depending on the amount of residual pine, outbreaks will continue to recur. So this is a case of a classical case of Panicky, the theory of ecosystem development put forward by Ganderson and Hollings in 2002. This is a very complicated diagram, but it reads like this. Look. Forests are born, they grow fast, they stagnate until a disturbance resets them back to zero. And the forest can cycle through this, or it can exit to a different ecosystem. So depending on the residual and regeneration. So these Panicky diagrams have been used extensively to describe not only the behavior of ecosystems, but also of societies. It's sort of like empires go, they build up until they crash. Now, so the exit could be to transition to other ecosystems, grasslands, for example, or to non-host, like in the case of that we documented in Williams Lake. So, stand replacing fires, this is the absolute conclusion. Initiate even-aged lodgepole pine stands. They reduce history of fire in the 20th century, and the new reduced fire conditions. Mountain pine beetle directs stand dynamics. Transforming stands into multiple age cohorts forests initiated by repeated beetle thinning, or they might be transitioned, or they might transition to other stand types. The long-term impacts on the timber supply are really very much alleviated by the presence of sub-canopies and advanced regeneration layers, which will form a reasonable, well-stocked forest in the future. Timber production is heavily impacted. Timber supply of British Columbia has a gap, but impacts on ecosystem services, for example, habitat for a species, if disturbance is part of the natural cycle, then it's business as usual. This is part of the ecosystem. In novel habitat, the outbreak will create impacts that depend on outbreak intensity, and potential transition to different ecosystems will create a different set of ecosystem services from those stands. Now, one of the caveats is that climate change will alter natural disturbance regimes, and what was natural before might not be natural. So this is the real unknown and challenge for forestry. So in areas where the beetle is endemic, it will be back. So we could, and this is not just a message joke, we could prepare for that by making stands less susceptible.